Michael Thompson was not just any man, he was a soldier, a son and a proud homeowner. His ranch stood tall on the edge of Willow Creek, a quiet suburban neighborhood, where children rode their bikes on summer evenings and families gathered for weekend barbecues. To an outsider, his property was simply a house with wide fields and an old red barn. But to Michael, it was his heart. His late father had built that farmhouse with his own two hands, laying every brick and nailing every board with sweat and love. Growing up, Michael learned more than how to care for livestock or mend fences. He learned the values of honor, family, and resilience. So when Michael joined the Army, leaving behind that ranch was the hardest thing he ever did. Yet he left with pride, believing that while he fought battles overseas, his home would stand as a symbol of his sacrifice. Before deployment, he had made every arrangement. He paid his bills early, left clear instructions with his younger sister, and even informed the local homeowners association, HOA, of his extended absence. "Don't worry," he told his sister Emma with a reassuring smile. "This ranch is in safe hands. When I return, it'll be waiting for me." At first, things seemed fine. Emma checked the mailbox once a week, and the grass was cut by a neighbor's teenage son. But after a few months, letters from the HOA began piling up. The first notice was minor. Grass too long, needs trimming. The second came quickly after. Fence paint fading, must repaint. Then the tone changed. Each letter grew sharper, as though the HOA was waiting for Michael to slip. They fined him for weeds in the driveway, for a missing shutter, even for the shade of brown on the barn door that apparently did not meet community standards. Emma tried her best to keep up. She spent weekends painting, cleaning, and pleading with the HOA board to understand Michael's absence. She explained again and again that her brother was overseas, serving his country. She thought that fact alone would earn compassion. But instead, the HOA seemed almost eager to exploit it. Weeks turned into months, and the fines ballooned from a few $100s to thousands. Each notice was colder than the last, filled with legal jargon and deadlines. By the end of the first year, the HOA labeled the property as neglected and threatened further action. Emma's heart sank when she read those words. She wrote letters, sent emails, and begged for more time. But the board remained unyielding. And then came the unthinkable. One spring morning, while Michael was thousands of miles away on a dusty battlefield, Emma drove to the ranch to water the plants. What she saw nearly brought her to her knees. A large sign hammered into the front yard. "Property auction. Foreclosure sale." She thought it must be a mistake. How could anyone sell a soldier's home without his knowledge? But it was no mistake. The HOA had quietly declared the ranch abandoned property. Using the mounting fines as justification, they pushed it into a legal loophole that allowed them to auction it off. Within weeks, the ranch was sold to a developer at a price far below its real worth. Emma tried everything, calling lawyers, filing appeals, but by the time the paperwork cleared, strangers had already moved into Michael's beloved home. When Emma finally managed to tell her brother the news over a crackling phone line, his silence spoke louder than words. The battlefield around him seemed quieter than usual, though his heart was louder than it had ever been. He had faced enemies with guns and grenades, yet nothing cut deeper than the betrayal waiting for him back home. The very people who should have respected his sacrifice had taken from him the one thing he fought hardest to protect, his family's legacy. But Michael was not a man who broke easily. He had stood in the desert heat, carried injured comrades, and kept marching when everything inside him screamed to stop. As Emma's voice trembled on the phone, apologizing for something that was never her fault, Michael made a silent vow. The HOA thought they had won. They thought they could erase his legacy with paperwork and greed. They were wrong, because when a soldier loses something dear, he doesn't surrender. He fights, not with weapons, not with anger, but with unshakable determination. The HOA had taken his ranch, but what they didn't realize was that they had also lit a fire in him, one that would soon grow too strong for them to contain. Michael's war overseas was coming to an end, but a new battle, one closer to home, was only just beginning. When Michael's deployment finally ended, The homecoming should have been the happiest day of his life. Soldiers around him hugged their families, children clung to fathers, and mothers wept with relief. Michael, too, was greeted with warm arms. His sister Emma stood waiting at the airport, holding a small sign that read, "Welcome home, hero." But behind her brave smile, Michael noticed the glimmer of sadness in her eyes. As they drove through the familiar streets of Willow Creek, Michael felt both nostalgia and unease. The neighborhood looked the same. White picket fences, manicured lawns, the smell of fresh-cut grass in the air, but something was missing. His ranch, his sanctuary, was no longer his. He asked Emma to take him there, but she hesitated. "Mike, it won't be easy," she whispered. When they pulled up, Michael's chest tightened. The porch swing his father had built was gone. The barn was freshly painted a dull gray. A different family's car sat in the driveway, and children he had never met played in the yard where he had once chased fireflies. The strangers waved politely, unaware of the storm brewing inside him. For Michael, it felt like standing on foreign soil in his own hometown. Back at Emma's house, she handed him a folder thick with papers. Every page was another wound: violation notices, fine calculations, letters full of threats, and finally, the legal documentation that stripped him of ownership. The ranch had been labeled abandoned and neglected. It was sold to a developer for less than a quarter of its true value. Michael sat in silence, his hand pressed against his forehead. The weight of the betrayal was crushing. He had faced enemy fire and lived through explosions. But this was a different kind of pain. The very community he had sworn to protect had turned against him when he was most vulnerable. Yet, as the night stretched on, grief hardened into resolve. Michael wasn't a man who gave up. He had survived battles because he knew how to fight smart, not just hard. And this battle, this unjust war at home, would be no different. The first step was to understand his enemy. The next HOA meeting was only a week away, and Michael went. Dressed in plain clothes, he slipped quietly into the back of the room. The board members spoke with arrogance, boasting about their successes in turning older properties into community investments. When they proudly mentioned his ranch as one of their biggest accomplishments, Michael's jaw clenched. He said nothing, but his presence alone made the room shift. Over the next few weeks, Michael attended every meeting, listening carefully, observing patterns, noting the names of those who seemed most proud of their actions. It wasn't long before whispers began circulating in the neighborhood. "That soldier whose ranch they sold is back." And then something unexpected happened. Old comrades began reaching out. Word of his situation spread among fellow veterans, and one by one they called him. "We've got your back," they said. These were men and women who had served beside him in the harshest of conditions, and now they were ready to stand beside him once more. The following HOA meeting was unlike any other. Michael walked in flanked by half a dozen veterans, all in civilian clothes but unmistakably carrying the dignity of service. They didn't shout or threaten. They simply sat down, their presence heavy with silent authority. The board shifted uncomfortably, their confident tone faltering. Soon, neighbors began to take notice as well. Families whispered in the hallways after meetings. "If they could take a soldier's home while he was serving, what's stopping them from taking ours?" Fear turned into anger. Anger turned into sympathy, and sympathy turned into support. Michael realized this fight wasn't just about his ranch anymore. It was about every family in Willow Creek who had ever been bullied or threatened by the HOA. The files Emma had collected weren't just evidence for his case. They were proof of a pattern. Dozens of families had been fined unfairly, intimidated, or forced to sell. So Michael started gathering stories. He knocked on doors, sat in living rooms, and listened to neighbors share their experiences. A retired teacher had lost her garden after being fined for unauthorized plants. A single mother had been threatened with eviction over a child's treehouse. One by one, their stories formed a mosaic of injustice. Every night, Michael and Emma worked late, building a case. The veterans helped too. Some researched legal statutes, others reached out to local officials. Slowly, the pile of evidence grew, and so did the determination of the community. The HOA board could feel the shift. For the first time, their authority was being questioned openly. Where once neighbors stayed silent, now they asked pointed questions. Meetings grew tense. The board's smug smiles faded. Michael didn't rush. He knew battles were won not by anger, but by strategy. He was patient, methodical, and precise. And as the community's faith in him grew, so did their courage. The storm was gathering strength, and it was only a matter of time before it broke. For Michael, the fight was no longer about reclaiming a single ranch. It was about reclaiming dignity, fairness, and justice for everyone. He had lost his home, but in return, he had found something far greater: the strength of unity. And deep down, he knew, when the storm finally struck, the HOA would never be the same again. The day of reckoning arrived on a warm Saturday morning. The HOA had called for a special community meeting, confident they could calm the growing unrest. They expected a handful of complaints, maybe a few heated questions. What they didn't expect was a hall packed wall-to-wall with neighbors, veterans, families, and even local reporters with cameras ready. Michael stood at the back at first, silent as always. He wasn't there for theatrics. He was there for justice. But when the meeting began and the HOA president started speaking about community progress, the murmurs in the crowd grew restless. Every word rang hollow. Finally, Michael stepped forward. He didn't need a microphone. His voice, steady and commanding, carried across the room with the same authority he had used on the battlefield. "My name is Michael Thompson," he began, "and this neighborhood used to be my home. While I was overseas serving my country, this board decided my property was abandoned. They sold my ranch without my knowledge, without my consent, and without the decency of even listening to my family's pleas." The room fell silent. Some board members shifted nervously in their seats. Michael held up a stack of papers, evidence gathered over weeks of sleepless nights. "These are not just my records," he continued. "They are the stories of dozens of families here, fined unfairly, bullied, intimidated, and in some cases forced out of the homes they loved. What happened to me isn't an isolated mistake. It's a pattern." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Neighbors began nodding, some even raising their own hands to confirm their experiences. One elderly woman stood up, her voice shaking as she said, "They fined me for planting roses in my yard. I couldn't afford it. I had to tear them all out." Another man added, "They threatened to foreclose on me over a broken mailbox." Each testimony added fuel to the fire. Behind Michael stood his fellow veterans, a quiet wall of strength. Their presence alone was enough to remind everyone of the values of honor and integrity. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing every word. The HOA board tried to interject, but the tide had already turned. Michael laid out the evidence piece by piece: fraudulent fines, procedural violations, misuse of community funds. He presented legal documents showing the HOA had overstepped its authority by declaring properties abandoned without proper due process. His preparation was meticulous, his delivery unshakable. "This board," Michael said, his eyes locking on the president, "forgot that a community is not built on rules and fines. It is built on trust, respect, and fairness. You broke that trust, and today, this community is taking it back." Applause erupted, echoing through the hall like thunder. The HOA president's face flushed red. He tried to regain control, but the crowd no longer respected his gavel or his titles. Families who had once been silent now shouted for resignations. Reporters captured the chaos as board members stumbled over excuses. The turning point came when Michael revealed his final piece of evidence: the sale records of his ranch. The auction had been conducted without proper notification, in direct violation of state law. The room erupted in outrage. The developer who had purchased the property quickly realized he was entangled in a scandal that could ruin him. Under pressure from the media and facing possible lawsuits, he had no choice but to void the purchase. Within weeks, not only was Michael's ranch returned to him, but the entire HOA board resigned under investigation. State authorities stepped in to review the association's actions, and several board members faced legal consequences for fraud and misconduct. But Michael didn't stop there. With the support of the community, he helped form a new leadership council, one that actually listened to homeowners. Families who had been wronged were compensated, and properties unfairly taken were either returned or settled fairly. What had once been a neighborhood ruled by fear transformed into a place of unity and pride. When Michael finally walked back onto his ranch, the emotions overwhelmed him. The porch was his again, the barn doors swung open with a familiar creak, and the fields stretched out like they had never left him. Emma stood by his side, tears in her eyes, while neighbors gathered to celebrate. Children ran through the grass, veterans raised flags, and laughter filled the air. For Michael, it wasn't just about getting his home back. It was about proving that no amount of greed or corruption could erase what was rightfully his. The HOA had underestimated him, believing one soldier couldn't stand against a system. But what they didn't realize was that a soldier never stands alone. His community had become his unit, and together they had reclaimed not only his house, but the dignity of every homeowner in Willow Creek. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in gold, Michael sat on the porch swing, the same swing his father once built, now restored. He watched the neighborhood with a quiet smile. For the first time in a long while, Willow Creek felt like home again. The battle was over. Justice had prevailed. And Michael's story became a reminder to all: when a community unites, no power, no board, no association, no title can ever take away what truly belongs to its people.